It seems kind of strange for me to introduce Greg to anybody, because it's hard for me to think of anybody who doesn't know him. Greg, if you follow photography in any way or form, or wildlife in South Africa, is probably one of the rock stars, if not the rock star of South African wildlife photography. A matriculant of the class of 1995, he unfortunately was a day boy and in Hofmeyer House, which we won't hold against him, but was a school prefect and played for the first water polo side and did swim. He also very famously captained the 5th rugby side, which I played in, so I recognize him as a captain, and started life as a wildlife guide for wilderness safaris training. And then about 16 years ago, took to photography. And for those of you who know this, I apologize, but of course by 2009 was exhibiting with National Geographic in London and is now recognized as probably one of the foremost photographers in an age where photography is an incredibly, incredibly difficult craft and art to pursue. And not only is it a craft and an art, but it's a business and it's a livelihood for him, and he does it incredibly successfully. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say, Greg. Greg is going to step onto the stage only because he has a presentation for us, and the room is going to descend into darkness. So can I please ask you to find your places, as it were, and know where everything is, because it's going to get dark very soon. Greg de Toit, gentlemen.
Thanks, Eugene, for that very kind introduction. The truth is, I spent 5 years here, like we all did, and back in 1991, when I was in Form 1, we didn't have these fancy facilities, so I spent many an uncomfortable hour sitting on the floor listening to the boss Bill Schroeder stand behind this podium. So tonight I actually insisted that I stand behind here and that the boss sits down there and roles can be reversed for a change. Great. So like I said, we were all Pretoria boys, high school boys, and we all have something incredible in common. Our journeys all began here. And my journey began here. And tonight, I have the wonderful privilege of being able to share a bit of what happened in my life after I left Boys High. And it's a great privilege to be here. And I'd like to especially thank my 1995 boys for coming out and supporting me. I appreciate it. Thanks, guys. All right, we can dim the lights. Thanks, John. John's backstage. Shame. John, you there? Great. All right, so I started here in 1991. In 1994, we had a very special guest speaker come and talk to our Wildlife Society, and he was Dr. Ian Player. Now, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Ian Player is the older brother, 10 years older than Dr. Ian Player. He's the older brother of the famous golfer Gary Player. And very sadly, Dr. Player passed away 2 years ago, but he did write the foreword to my coffee table book. And when I was a 16-year-old boy attending this school, I heard Dr. Player talk, and he explained a little bit about his life and how he returned from World War II, and he went into the bush of Zululand, which in those days you can imagine was incredibly wild. And he found healing in the bush from all the trauma that he had experienced during the war. Another thing he did was he canoed from Pietermaritzburg to Durban. And that was the start of the Doozy Marathon. So he was obviously an incredible man. In the 40s and 50s, he spearheaded a project called Operation Rhino. And back in those days, not many of us recall that, but we only had 500 rhino left in South Africa. And he built those numbers back to 15,000. Now, as a young schoolboy, listening to Dr. Ian Player talk, I very much wanted to live a life like he had. I wanted to live a life of adventure and danger and exploring the wilds of Africa. And when I left school in 1995, I went straight to the bush. I went down to Timbavati and I started working in the bush. And what I was doing, unknowingly but subconsciously, after hearing Dr. Ian Player talk here, was I was searching for the lost Africa, the truly wild Africa that he had spoken about, that he had experienced, and that had ignited the imagination of the schoolboy in me. But it was only in the year 2004 that my wife and I moved to Kenya, and we interviewed for a camp manager job in the Great Rift Valley. Now, last month I gave this talk in Cincinnati, so this slide was for the Americans because you need to show them where Africa is in general. But since you guys all went to a very good school and are very well educated, that's Africa, right? There's the boundary line between Kenya and Tanzania. And where my story tonight plays out is in that little green circle there, just north of a lake called Lake Natron. Now, when we moved there, I felt like Marty McFly in Back to the Future. It was literally like traveling back in time, and I was absolutely fascinated by the Maasai tribespeople. They have big spears. They are warriors. They like to walk far. They have cows for money, and they like fires. Actually, the Maasai really like fires. To be honest, they like really big fires. So when we moved there, I was absolutely appalled. I'd studied fire ecology, and they were literally burning the place down. But it didn't take me long to realize that the Maasai knew what they were doing. They were able to transform their land from this to this through the skillful use of fires. Now, the next photograph is the same scene, just slightly zoomed out. And the clan of Maasai that live in the South Rift Valley of Kenya are called the Lodokolani. And the Lodokolani clan are slightly different in that they have predominantly white beads and less of that traditional red that we all see on documentaries. Now, my wife and I had the privilege of living on a tent on the very wall of the Rift Valley. And looking down into the Rift Valley, we would often see spectacular scenes like this, with these massive dust storms just sweeping across the Rift Valley. And I'd photographed a number of these dust storms from the wall of the Rift Valley, and I knew that being a wildlife photographer, one day I would have to go into one of these storms and try and capture a photograph. And that's what I did. And that's a photograph of a zebra stallion standing in the middle of one of those storms. Now, there's something very, very special about Maasai land, which not a lot of people realize. But you get a very rare type of lion there that we call free-ranging lion, all right? Free-ranging lions are basically lions that don't live in a formal park or game reserve. So they are still just roaming Africa wild and free like all lions once did. And there's a very simple explanation for this, and that is simply that the Maasai don't eat wild meat. So traditionally the Maasai drink blood, milk, and they would eat the meat of their domestic animals, but they don't eat wild meat, and that's still like that to this day. So there's a shot of the blood calabash. So as a result, you get scenes like this in Maasai land, where you just have a whole herd of giraffe living outside of a park or reserve. And by both international standards and African standards, this is something truly special and something truly unique. I'm sure many of you have heard of the famous Masai Mara Game Reserve in Kenya. It's especially well known for the Great Migration, and of course, its massive crocodiles. I have to tell you, this zebra did not get away. So why am I talking about the Masai Mara? Well, you see, the Masai Mara is also in the heart of Masai land. That reserve exists because of the Masai. It is an unfenced reserve. And if we go across the border into Tanzania, where the Great Migration heads south around about November every year, it's a 15,000 square kilometer ecosystem. it's so big, that ecosystem, that it can dwarf the largest land mammal on planet Earth. Incredible bird life there. And this is where the migration goes to calve around about February time. Again, I'm talking about the Serengeti because it's also in the heart of Maasai land. I've been spending a lot of time this year in the Ngorongoro crater, which has been a real joy and privilege. The Ngorongoro crater has been dubbed the 8th natural wonder of the world. Down on the bottom, you get these big tusker elephant bulls. You get predators, lions, and you get a very, very special creature. You can well imagine how rare these are, free-ranging black rhino that move between the crater and the Serengeti. And again, this is all part of Maasai territory. Another famous park, Amboseli, especially famous for its elephants, is also in Maasai territory. So there's a very good reason why one of the last populations left in Africa of free-ranging lion exists in Maasai land, and this is where we were living. And I'll never forget one night, because ever since I left Pretoria Boys High, I'd been searching for this real Africa, the wild Africa. And I remember falling asleep one night in my tent, and I heard lions roar in the valley below. And I woke up in the morning, and I heard the jingle of goat bells. And I suddenly realized that here I am, living my boyhood dream. You know, here I am in an Africa so wild that lions and Maasai herdsmen, lion and cattle, lion and livestock, still share the same resource. They still go out there every day and do battle. The warriors walk with their spears and they graze their cattle in amongst, you know, the plains game and the lions. And I realized that I was finally living this boyhood dream that I dreamt about ever since I was a 16-year-old boy at this school. And what I decided to do as a photographer was to go in pursuit of getting a photograph of a free-ranging lion. Now, these are different lions, all right? They live outside of parks. They're strictly nocturnal. They've learned to avoid human beings at all costs. And I thought that if I could get a photograph of a free-ranging lion, I would then have evidence that I had found this wild Africa of my dreams. So I decided to jump into this project, and I went in search of lions on the floor of the Rift Valley. It was very much like looking for a needle in a haystack. These lions are like ghosts. But I managed to find a waterhole not far from our camp, and I saw fresh lion tracks around this waterhole. And I know lions need to drink every 24 hours, so I figured I would dig a hole next to the waterhole. I would jump inside it. I had some Hessian sacking, some clothing, and I threw that on top of myself, and I figured I'd wait about a week and I'd get the shot of the lions drinking. So for the first 3 months sitting in my hole at the waterhole, this is what I photographed. Absolutely nothing. Yeah. The wildlife that still exists in the South Rift Valley is obviously very shy, and I had gone and dug a hole right next to the water because photographers always want to be close, and the animals could smell me and probably see me, and it was pretty hopeless. But there was a turning point for me, and that was after 3 months, this bird rocks up for a drink. And that bird's called the Kori bustard. And when the animals saw this bird drinking, they figured, oh, well, it must be safe. So that bird brought a friend. And that friend then brought her friends. And slowly the animals started coming in. All right. The zebras were incredibly shy, so they would approach the waterhole tentatively. I would take literally one photograph, and they would bolt and head for the hills. So I got lots of practice as a photographer shooting what we call motion blur. And after another 3 months, eventually the zebras would drink, and they would allow me to photograph consecutive frames. So if you look at that photograph, all the if you look at their ears, they're all facing forward, so they know I'm in the hole, you know, and they're very nervous. So I wait another 3 months because these lions are just not showing up. They're drinking at night. I hear them roar. I see their tracks. I need them to drink in the daylight because remember, all these photographs were taken with film. The guys are matriculated after 2000. I'll explain that to you later. eventually the zebra were drinking the way zebras like to drink, all right? Zebras like to walk into the water to drink. And yeah, they're walking into the water, they still know I'm there, but they're letting me photograph. The general game would sort of come and go. You know, they come, they drink quickly, they leave. And throughout this project, there was only one constant at that waterhole, and that was this pair of Egyptian geese. Now, these geese claimed this waterhole as their own little patch of water. They were there without fail every single day that I was. In fact, they were there so often that while I was waiting for the lions to come and drink, I played a little game to see how many photographs of animals I could get in the background of the geese. And so that became a whole little project on its own. Then there was another turning point in this project. About a year after setting out to capture one of these free-ranging lion images, I was not winning because they were only drinking at nighttime. But there was one particular week where it was incredibly hot. And I was sitting in my hole being bit by tsetse flies, and I totally lost it. So I jumped out the hole and I just ran and I jumped into the water. Now the water hole was only about as long as the stage and the same width deep. And it was only about knee deep, depth. So it wasn't terribly refreshing, but at least the tsetse flies weren't biting me. And after I jumped into the water, something amazing happened. I was lying there on my back, and this male Defusser waterbuck walked in and drank right in front of me. Now, for the entire year leading up to this point, I'd not once seen a male Defusser waterbuck, never mind have him drink right in front of me. So I had a thought. And the thought I had was, what if I make the water my new hide? So what if, instead of sitting in the hole, I sit in the water every day? Maybe it'll mask my scent, mask my sound, do whatever it did to bring that male waterbuck in to drink. But of course, I was in Hofmeyer House, so I'm not a total idiot. So I thought about crocodiles, all right? And obviously crocs are dangerous. I'd spent a year at this one waterhole. I knew for a fact there weren't crocodiles, so that was not a problem. What about hippos? We all know hippos are dangerous. There weren't any hippo in that waterhole. I was absolutely certain of that. Another concern of mine was buffalo. Thanks. So the thing with buffalo is, especially the old boys, they quite enjoy getting into the water. That's why we call them Dagga boys. For those of you who don't know, Dagga in Zulu is mud. And these old Dagga boys love to get into water. And I figured that there were a couple old bulls not too far away in a fig forest, but if they were to come along, I would hear their horns clunk, and I would just quickly make a discreet exit out the back of the waterhole. Then another big concern of mine was, of course, elephants. And the thing with elephants is they love water, and young bulls like to play. And they especially like to play in water. And the other concerning thing about elephants is when they approach a waterhole, they're dead silence, so I wouldn't hear them coming. But the good news for me is that the South Rift Valley of Kenya is one of the driest, most inhospitable places. You do get elephants there, but not in large numbers. So I figured that was a feasible risk. And then, of course, lions themselves are potentially very dangerous. Anyway, after lying in the water, thinking about this for a whole 5 minutes, I decided, nah, screw it. And I jumped into the water. And from this point on, I was no longer using the hole, but I was sitting in the water, cradling my camera in my hands with my bum ensconced in the mud, and holding my camera above the water. So it was just my camera and my head above the water, waiting for animals. Now, I need to take an interlude here to just mention my wife at this point was not at all happy. But the animals didn't mind. It worked. This strategy worked better than I could ever have imagined. This bushbuck, I'd never once seen a bushbuck in the South Rift Valley. I didn't even know you got them there. And these bushbuck come in to drink. The animals could not see me. They could not hear me. They never knew if I was to the left or to the right. And the whole time, I was under their noses. Now, being a wildlife photographer, I was as happy as a pig in mud. Right. I was building my portfolio. I was getting eye-level shots of all these incredible animals. And although I never lost sight of my goal, waiting for the lions, I was so enjoying just being able to photograph all these wonderful eye-level shots. The only problem I had was a resident troop of baboons. Now, still to this day, I loathe baboons because it's the only animal I know that'll walk up to a waterhole, have a drink, then pee in the waterhole, turn around, defecate in the waterhole, only to leave and come back the next day to drink from the same waterhole. So now when you're sitting in that waterhole and the dry season is sort of getting to the end and the water's evaporating and you're basically sitting in baboon feces and urine, you learn to loathe the baboon. I developed this really strange rash that we put down to baboon urine. And before I got home every night, I'd have to shower before my wife would let me in. And my clothes, we called swamp clothes, I used to hang on a bush outside. And when I had to put them on in the morning to go back to the waterhole, I would have to wet the clothes because they were stuck stiff from all the baboon urine. But the strategy worked. The birds drank beside me, and the zebras now drank so close to me that I could have leant out and touched them. My faithful friends were there every step of the way. I watched these geese build a nest. I first watched them mate. I watched them build a nest. I watched them incubate the eggs. The young goslings would swim around me in circles, cocking their head up at me, and I would sit there with a 400mm lens trying to get shots of them. I then watched those young goslings grow up and eventually be chased off by the parents. But still, no lions came to the waterhole during the daytime. And this was a photograph I took from our tent, looking towards the back of the Rift Valley wall. And I knew that once the rains came, my chances of getting shots of these lions would disappear, because as soon as the rains came, there would be water all over the floor of the Rift Valley, and the lions would no longer need to come and drink specifically at this waterhole. And I'll never forget it. It was an incredibly hot week building to the short rains in October. And it was a Friday afternoon, and I'd been sitting in my waterhole for about 2 hours when suddenly my 2 Egyptian geese started hissing and honking, and they leapt into the water. And I'd never seen them behave like this. So I sort of peered sort of over the back and looked off into the distance, and I saw 2 lionesses sauntering straight to the waterhole. And those of you who are wildlife enthusiasts, you'll know what I mean when I talk about the way lions saunter on a hot day. And what I did was I lowered my head, checked my settings, and when I looked up, I had this in front of me. So I had these 2 lionesses drinking right in front of me. And you know what I did? I completely froze up. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. And I was very aware of the irony, because I'd been waiting for well over a year for this moment. And here it was in front of me. And my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't shoot. So what I did was I closed my eyes. I think I said a prayer. For those photographers in the audience, I pushed my film a stop, which in those days was all we could do. And I managed to get my shaking hands under some degree of control, and I managed to start photographing. Now, I only had 1 roll of film, and luckily these lionesses were incredibly thirsty, so they just kept drinking and kept drinking and kept drinking. I took about 27 frames, which are just a complete blur to me. I don't even remember taking these shots. And what I then wanted to do was to get a vertical photograph of one of the lionesses drinking. So with my camera in my hands, I tilted my camera into a vertical position, and when I did that, this elbow protruded above the water, and this is the reaction I got. Now, you don't need to be an expert in lion behavior to know that that's not how you want a lion to be looking at you. And remember, there are 2 lionesses both looking at me like that, and this moment I remember very clearly. Her head was dwarfed just by these muscles, and I'm sitting about 4 yards in front of her, so I'm literally 1 leap away from her. And again, I had a few thoughts go through my mind. So the first question I asked myself was, what does this lioness think I am? You know, does she know I'm a person? Does she think I'm a goose? I have no idea. The second question was, whatever she thinks I am, does she want to eat me? The third thing I thought about doing was standing up and shouting and asserting myself as a human being. Now, having worked shortly after I left school as an apprentice wilderness trails guide, I had lots of experience with lions on foot, and normally if you stand your ground and you shout to them, they will back down. But the problem is, all animals have what we call a fight circle and a flight circle. The fight circle is a very small circle around the animal, and if you give an animal a fright within its fight circle, it will attack rather than flee. So I thought jumping up and making a big noise would not have been the way to go. What I really wanted to do was to just get out that waterhole and run in the opposite direction. But thankfully, having trained as a walking guide again, I knew to never run from lions. As soon as you run from a lion, you behave like it's prey and it's going to chase you. So while I was thinking about this, I had one last question going through my head, and that was, why had I not thought about any of this before? And much to my relief, both females started drinking again. And if you look at her posture, the one ear cocked back to sort of back behind, and they started drinking again. I started breathing again. By now, my roll of film was pretty much done. I'd got my shots, and I just wanted to get out of there. So my strategy was to hold my camera in my right hand, grab the muddy floor of the waterhole with my left hand, and slowly wiggle my bum, and I was going to inch my way out of this waterhole. But every time I moved, I got the same reaction from both lionesses. So I would have to wait until they started drinking again. I would then move. I would then wait. I would then move. I would then wait. I would then move. And what I learned about waterholes on that particular day was that they tend to get shallower towards the outside. So sort of more and more of my body was becoming exposed, and the lionesses were becoming more and more interested in me, and eventually their tails were going, their ears were back, and it was getting dark. So at this point, what I did was I flopped over onto my tummy, and I was pulling my way along through the mud, trying to get as much water between me and these two lionesses as possible. And I remember thinking two things. One is how ridiculous this must look from the air. And the second was, should I feel claw marks in my back, I'll throw my camera onto land, my photographs will survive. Now this gives you a glimpse into the scary mind of a wildlife photographer. I eventually couldn't take it anymore, so I leapt to my feet and I ran. But there was enough water between me and these two lionesses. And I looked over my shoulder, and both lionesses had leapt to their feet. And with eyes as big as saucers, I swear I heard one say to the other, "Gee whiskers, that was a human after all." As soon as I saw the lionesses, I knew that they got a bigger fright than I did. And all the danger kind of dissipated. And I walked back to the camp, and I had one roll of film that was representing close on 15 months worth of work. And I took that roll of film and I put it in the gas fridge. And the next morning I woke up, I had nothing to do. And I walked over to the gas fridge, I opened the door, I look at the film. I think to myself, did I expose correctly? Did I focus properly? I couldn't remember anything. And then I closed the film. I closed the fridge. And then I spent the rest of the day panicking because it's such a hot area. When I opened the fridge, all the hot air rushed in. It could have condensed on the film. And if you condensed on film, the film was ruined. So I spent the rest of the day completely fretting. So in a really bizarre twist of events, my wife came to me and said, "Greg, would you please go back to the waterhole because you're driving me nuts?" So I went back to the waterhole. And I wasn't going to sit in the water again, there's no ways, but I dug my hole again, and I sat back in the hole, and a week later, an amazing thing happened. Both those lionesses returned, and this time they brought their cubs. So there were, the one lioness had 4 cubs, and the one had 3 cubs. And I've actually kept in touch with these lions, trying to go back over the years, and especially that third one from the left, that one I've got to know quite well. For me, this was a very special shot because a journey that started here as a 16-year-old boy, I'd finally put it to rest when I got a photograph of a free-ranging lion. But of course, I didn't know I'd got the photos yet because it was all just one roll of film. Shortly after taking this photograph, I got very sick. And during this project, I had malaria twice. I had bilharzia. I had a little worm living in my foot. And every night, my wife would mark it with a Koki, and we'd see where and how far it had moved the next morning. I had a type of fly called putsi fly. Their larvae were hatching out my back because when I was sitting in the waterhole with my wet shirt, the flies had laid their larvae in my back. Anyway, so I then left, came back to South Africa, took my one roll of film to Pro Lab in Queenswood there, gave it to the lady behind the counter, asked her to please be very careful with it. She smiled at me and said, "Sir, we are careful with all our customers' film." I'll never forget that. Got the film developed, rushed back to my parents' house, put it on the light box, and for the very first time, I saw the photographs that you guys have seen tonight. And for the very first time, I felt like I had found my wild Africa. Now, the reason why I did this project was purely for selfish reasons. It was for me, it was to find my wild Africa. So it was only quite a few years later, about 4 years later, that this story was first published. It was published in Africa Geographic magazine. And that cover, that photograph became the cover to my coffee table book some 10 years later. The BBC Wildlife magazine then contacted me, and they did an article titled "The Waiting Game." And from there, the newspapers got wind of the story, and it really spread like wildfire. So the Guardian in the UK did an interview, the Independent. But of all the newspaper clippings, this is the only one I kept. It's my favorite one. If you look in the, this is a Scottish paper. If you look in the top left corner there, they call me a snapper. Now, wildlife photographers don't like to be called snappers. And if you look at the headline there, it says, "Gutsy Greg spent months in the water with lions." It's like the lions and I were doing backstroke together. So, honestly, newspapers get a lot wrong, and I found this quite funny, but it does hang in my study at home. The Sunday Times did an article, and the BBC World Service called, and eventually we got an invite to go on live television on a Sunday morning in New York. Now, I was absolutely petrified, but there was no reason for me to be petrified because they weren't interested in talking to me in the least. All they wanted to do was talk to my wife and find out how she stays married to such a lunatic, which was a fair question. Eventually, National Geographic got in touch, and I'm an exhibit for them in London, on the high streets of London. This is the poster to the exhibit, and I especially love the title, "Authentic Africa." That's the gallery in London on Regent Street, and that's me standing outside the front. I eventually got a magazine cover. It was my first magazine cover from this project, and there's the original photograph there. And then something that was very special for me was when Africa Geographic magazine turned 15 years old, they assembled a portfolio of the 15 best photographs from 15 years. And one of the shots that I took during this project of a zebra drinking surrounded by dust made it into that portfolio. I've subsequently... Thank you. Thanks very much. I've been sponsored by Nikon subsequently, and they use this image. Now, it's quite incredible for me that all of this came out of one waterhole. But what's even more special for me tonight to be speaking here is that this journey really began here at this school on a hill as a young 16-year-old boy when I heard Dr. Ian Player talk. And if you read the introduction to my book, it says it there. I've been asked some tough questions about this project. I've given this talk all over northern Finland, you name it, the States, in London, and I've been asked a lot of difficult questions, and I'd just like to run through a few of them with you. Why did I not use a remote control? I mean, it surely wasn't necessary to sit in the water and endanger your life. Well, the thing is, I only had one camera body, and with remotes, you would need about 10 cameras to cover a circular waterhole, and of course, a remote can only give you a vertical or horizontal shot, so you wouldn't have been able to get both. Another question I get asked is, why did you sit in the water? What's wrong with you? But I think tonight I've explained to you guys I did try a different strategy. It just wasn't working. Another question I get asked, normally by old ladies my mother's age, is why did you not take precautions? The thing is, it was so hot there that I could not have worn a wetsuit. I would have literally have died of dehydration within the first day. Another question I get asked often is, are you healthy now? And in 2014, I saw the top infectious disease specialist in Johannesburg, and he gave me a clean bill of health. So I'm fit and healthy, which is great. And another question I get asked is, why did you do it? People just don't understand why I did it. The thing is, I'm a wildlife photographer, so I live to do stuff like this. But I think I've explained tonight as well. The reason I did this was I was looking for sort of my wild Africa, and this photograph represented that journey to me and the success of that journey. So that's really why I did it. Nowadays, I give this talk all over the place to raise awareness and funds for lion conservation. It's very sad, but Kenya now currently has less than 2,000 lions left in total. That's including free ranging and in the parks and reserves. And if you look at the continent as a whole, we've lost 40% of our lion population in the last 30 years. So I now do this talk to help raise awareness, but initially I did it for purely selfish reasons. And then I think the question I've been asked the most, that has also caused me the most reflection, is how did you have the patience to sit in the water for 270 hours? Some journalist worked that out, that it was 270 hours. And this question has really bugged me because I'm not a patient person. But everyone keeps telling me you must have a lot of patience. So I've had to reflect on this. And the only sort of logical explanation that I've managed to come up with is that when I was sitting in the water, I was not just waiting for the lions to come. I was enjoying all the beauty that was happening around me. So when the whirligig beetles swam in clumsy circles around my legs, I watched them, I enjoyed it. The water snails would crawl up my arms and hide under my watch strap, and I would watch that. I would listen to the birds. I would give song lyrics to their calls. Sometimes there was nothing happening at the waterhole, and I would just watch the clouds roll in. I saw the most incredible things at that waterhole. I once saw a falcon swoop in and catch a dove right in front of me. So I think by focusing on the beauty around me, I was able to see this project through, and that is what has been credited to me as patience. Another question I get asked quite a bit is, would you do it again? And the funny thing is I did, and we don't have time to play the documentary tonight, but if you go onto my website, you can see a documentary we made a couple years ago. But I went back to my waterhole, and the amazing thing was, this was like 7 years later, and I found my geese still in attendance. And then, thank you. And then the last question I get asked a lot as a wildlife photographer is, what's your favorite animal to photograph? And I've been very fortunate. I've spent lots of time with leopards. I've done a big project for the BBC on leopards, lots of time with wild dogs, but lions are without a doubt my favorite animal. So just to close, I would really like to share with you guys some of my personal favorite lion photographs. And this one I call Lion Cub Sneeze. One of the cubs sneezed and they saw the water vapor for the first time. I especially like male lions because they are so powerful and regal, but so stupid and goofy. I find that a really intoxicating mix. A lot of my wildlife colleagues give me a hard time about liking lions because they say, you know what, Greg, lions just sleep. They're so boring. But I like sleeping lions. The shot of a lion on the grass plains in the Serengeti. And this is a mating pair of lions where the male is gesturing for some more. And this is on a really cold winter's night in the Lowveld in Kruger. There are very few nights of the year cold enough to get this breath on this condensation on a lion's breath. I was just in the Lowveld now and it was too warm. I love this lion. He's probably the most famous lion ever to live. His name's Notch. And him and his 4 sons ruled the Masai Mara. They were so hardcore, they crossed the river, went and blixened the lions on the other side and came back. And Notch just one day walked off into the sunset, never to be seen again. He lived like a king, he died like a king. And that's his son. Took me many years to get a photograph of a lion in a forest. And this is one of the famous Mapocho coalition lions that lived in Kruger. These lions, we call them Hell's Angels. There were 6 of them. They killed and ate another 80 lions. Yeah, it's notch again. Quite enjoy this shot if you look at that baby wildebeest calf and how it's completely dwarfed by that lioness. It took me 18 years to see a pangolin. I've now seen 3, but the first pangolin I ever saw, a lion was playing with it. I call this one poetry in motion. But the reason I love lions the most, and just 3 nights ago I was in the bush and I heard lions roar. And, there's just no sound like it. And this is a short clip that I'm going to play you of a lion that I filmed in the Okavango Delta in the rain. Thanks, guys. So tonight, I've shared a very special part of my journey with you all. And it's a journey that began here at Pretoria Boys High School as a 16-year-old when I first heard Dr. Ian play a talk to the Wildlife Society in the staff room. This is a place where all our journeys began. And it's a really great privilege for me tonight to call you all brothers. And as such, I would like to invite you all to be upstanding with your glasses in hand to toast this fine school. To Boys Are, the greatest school in the world.